In this video, we're going to go over some very basic and helpful tips for color mixing. We're going to use primary colors to create secondary colors. So to begin, I want to start by explaining my setup here. I have a basic color mixing tray here. It's just a simple clear plastic plate that I got from the grocery store. And I'm going to show you color mixing using these neon paints, these paint cakes, because that's all I have with me right now. But this can work with regular paint cakes that we have in our classroom. It would also work with watercolors or even liquid paint if you have those kinds of paints. So one helpful tip that I want to talk about with color mixing is the size of brush that you're going to use. I recommend using a smaller size brush because a smaller brush helps to limit the amount of water that is in your brush. A large brush will hold more water, and when you're color mixing and you have too much water in your brush, your paint is going to end up pretty thin and watery. And when you have watery paint, the color won't be quite as bright or as vibrant. So I'm going to begin by mixing some secondary colors. Secondary colors are when you take two primary colors and mix them together. Let's take a look at the color wheel. You'll see the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, and when we mix primaries together, we will get colors called secondary colors, which is green, orange, and purple. I'm going to begin by mixing red and blue together to make the secondary color purple because my paint set does not have a purple in it. So I'm going to start with some red, and I'm going to really load up my brush with that red, and then I'm going to apply it onto my paint mixing tray. After I put some red down onto my mixing tray, I'm going to make sure to wash my brush off really well before I apply the blue. Wipe off the drips from the edge of the cup and then circulate my brush into the blue and pick up some blue, and then I'm just going to add it directly onto my red and start mixing those two colors together. Now, when you're exploring and practicing color mixing, it does take some time to build up the color that you want. So you might find that you have to go back and forth between colors in order to get the color that you want. So for example, if I want my purple to be more like a red-violet color, I'm going to add more red to it. It kind of turns more into like a magenta. Adding red warms up that color a little bit. But if I add more blue, that's going to give me a more cool colored version of purple, more like a blue-violet. So here I'm just going to continue kind of playing around and exploring what happens to the color if I add more red versus if I add more blue. So now one thing to be mindful of is accidentally color mixing in the paint palette. We want to keep the colors in the paint palette unmixed, and we want to try to keep them as clean as possible. That way they are ready and clean for the next class of students who will be using them. Your paint palette might be mixing because of your water. When we rinse our brushes in the water cup, sometimes the brush picks up a little bit of that paint water, and then when we dip it into the palette, it accidentally mixes. So one way to prevent this is to keep your water clean. If you start noticing your paint palette is getting mixed and you notice your water is getting really dark in color, it might be time for some fresh water. Something else that you can do to fix a mixed paint palette is to dab the mixed paint with a paper towel. You want to do this right away while the paint is still wet. As soon as you notice a color is mixed, get a paper towel and bunch it up and dab it into the mixed color. The paper towel will start to absorb the watery paint and clean it up pretty easily. but you have to do it right away before the paint dries in the palette. Once that paint dries, it's a lot more difficult to get it cleaned off. Okay, so now, even though my paint set already has orange and green in it, I'm still going to try to mix them just to explore and see what I can come up with.